Before I begin, I want to tell the family that this is one of those video essays that became something of a rabbit hole. The more you dig, the deeper it goes, and the more interesting stuff you come to, and it's been on my mind for a while now. But the reason that I've been somewhat reluctant with going forward with it is you gotta be careful with some subjects. Because frankly, there's certain subjects, as we all know, that some black folks just don't handle very well. And I don't want to get into conspiracy corner, because frankly, when it comes to talking about how white supremacy has been able to move behind the scenes, black people tend to substitute all sorts of spookism for the facts, and that doesn't help. As I've told you before, the United States has never been democratic, not for a single day in its existence. And that's not an accident. This country was never meant to be democratic. It's one of those things that they didn't want, a democracy. And when George Washington and the other English subjects in the colonies decided to have their little brawl with the king's men, they gained the upper hand eventually, and these guys didn't want democracy. Democracy is exactly what they were trying to avoid. The United States is and has always been a fascist state. That means corporate interest ruled, and so-called government is just a shadow to rubber stamp it. That is the truest saying in the world, that government is the shadow cast by business. Sure, there will still be alleged congressmen and government departments, but these guys aren't where the real power lies. Their function happens to be to sign off on whatever the real power wants. And what the real power wants these days is to not be a de facto government. They want to be the government in all but name. Unquestionably, the functions of the government being privatized, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's the thin end of the wedge, without the people's knowledge or consent. You have corporations that are taking on more and more governmental responsibilities, things that were previously the government's domain. Education, the military, national intelligence gathering, analysis. What goes unsaid, though, is as the government hands over more of its responsibilities over to private interests, it's handing over more of its power to private interests. This is happening in every sector. You have so-called members of the government who are nothing more than paid mouthpieces for this or that corporation who say this is what it's supposed to be. This is how Blackwater is able to roll into New Orleans, and without blinking an eyelash, they're automatically deputized and given quickie contracts to patrol the city. Here's a story that the white media didn't even bother to focus on. Basically, Jeremy Scahill, about the only guy who actually bothered to report on it, and everybody else just said, oh well, we need more guns down here to control the Negras. And when you look at who it is who runs these private companies, you see that these people are the same individuals who are usually in political office in many cases, and the same men who give donations to politicians in multi-million-dollar chunks. Off the top of my head, a good example would be Robert Mercer, the billionaire tech investor and hedge fund manager. He's the guy who put up the money to turn Breitbart into a going concern when Steve Bannon came in and took over. That was where Steve Bannon got the money from to make it where Breitbart became the white supremacist hub that it is today. It went from being just a white supremacist toilet to a white supremacist cesspool. It took big money, though, to make that happen. It took Robert Mercer to do that. Now, another example, and this is one that we're going to be focusing on for most of this video essay, is going to be the Carlyle Group. I'm sure you probably heard their name before. Michael Moore mentioned them in his documentary Fahrenheit 9/11. Now, the Carlyle Group claims to be a private equity firm, but when you look at who it is that's actually in the Carlyle Group, you see a lot of big-name government officials from the United States and Europe. Former British Prime Minister John Major is part of the Carlyle Group. Former Secretary of State James Baker, who as Secretary of State was over the CIA. Former Secretary of Defense Frank Carlucci, who in that capacity was also over the Defense Intelligence Agency. He also did a stint working for the CIA. You have guys like RJR Nabisco and IBM Chairman Lou Gerstner, who left IBM to head the Carlyle Group. And you got a ton of other individuals with them. Because, as we all know, the most famous members of the Carlyle Group happens to be the Bush crime family. Poppy Bush and his deluded sons were members of the Carlyle Group. Well, you would look at that and think, well, obviously this is just a bunch of right-wing zealots who set up their own little money laundering scheme. Now, while you could be easily forgiven for assuming that, after all, when you look at this gallery of rogues that populates the Carlyle Group, you see a bunch of right-wing luminaries. However, You would think the Carlyle Group is nothing but a bunch of far-right zealots, and you would be wrong. George Soros is himself a Carlyle investor to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah, George Soros, who, if I need remind you, also used his money to start Black Lives Matters. See, ain't that what Neely Fuller's always told us? White supremacy seeks to control both sides of the argument, and the reason why is that's a basic tenet of warfare. How do you guarantee that you win a war? By controlling both sides. So you see, for white supremacists, there's no such thing as left wing or right wing. It's all white power, especially where the subject of controlling black people is concerned. That's the only true ideology that these white supremacist power brokers have. After Michael Moore exposed the Bush crime family's connection to the Carlyle Group pretended to distance themselves from the Bush family. But it's commonly understood that the Bush family is as deeply involved in the Carlyle Group as they've ever been. According to Forbes magazine, the Carlyle Group has more private equity funds and investors and assets than any other firm in the country. The Carlyle Group also owns at least 209 companies, ranging from Hertz to Mrs. Fields Cookies. You can Google Carlyle's holdings, by the way. It's a who's who of name brand corporations, Supreme Products, Getty Images, Veritas Software, among a ton of others. When you go to the Carlyle Group's own website to see the companies they own, it's just page after page after page of corporations and companies all over the world. The list of corporations under the Carlyle Group is so long, it's ridiculous. I think you're beginning to understand that the Carlyle Group has a lot of subsidiary companies that they run. But what they do goes way beyond just financial scheming. These men are already wealthy. It's not money that they're after anymore. What they want are all the things that money can't buy. Now, for those of you who are paying attention, you'll recall that some while back I did a video about black people starting our own intelligence gathering operations. I briefly touched on private intelligence firms such as Fusion GPS and Stratfor, but I also briefly mentioned Booz Allen Hamilton, which was and remains one of the biggest and most influential companies in private intelligence. Edward Snowden, the man who absconded with all those secrets from the NSA, worked for Booz Allen. Well, you won't be surprised to learn that the Carlyle Group used to own Booz Allen Hamilton, and they made billions of dollars off of that. The Carlyle Group has made $2 billion off of Booz Allen, documented. Starting in 2014, however, the Carlyle Group began quietly divesting themselves of Booz Allen Hamilton stock, selling the last of their shares in the company in December 2016. But that's not to say that they've cut ties with Booz Allen, because it seems a number of former Booz Allen alumni have been finding gainful employment in the Carlyle Group. Peter Clare is currently managing director of the Carlyle Group. He's also a member of the board of directors of Booz Allen Hamilton. Nolan Hart was a senior associate at Booz Allen from November 2014 until December 2016, when he left to become vice president of the Carlyle Group. He's only in his 30s, by the way, early 30s, might I add. Larry Pryor, former head of CSRA, one of the biggest information technology service providers in the world. He left CRSA to join the Carlyle Group. Now, in all fairness, CSRA is not Booz Allen Hamilton, nor is it a Booz Allen Hamilton subsidiary. CSRA, however, is an intelligence and communications corporation that works for the U.S. government and U.S. military. But Larry Pryor is in the same orbit as the Booz Allen Hamilton guys. That's the point I want to get across to you. Now, there's plenty of others, but I think you're starting to get the point. Now, why is the Carlyle Group snatching up all of these people from Booz Allen when they used to own the company? Because the Carlyle Group wants to bring those functions totally in-house. Equity investment is merely how they finance their real goal. And for people like the Carlyle Group, that goal has always been control. See, when you have a so-called equity firm run by former government intelligence officials or corporate giants, now they've got their own private intelligence company. There's nothing else that a reasonable person can call this other than fascism, one that works very closely with the government. But also, since it's privately owned, they don't have to disclose their own intelligence gathering operations. These men now have all the same power and abilities that they had in government, but at this point, they have none of the vulnerabilities, such as public oversight or restrictions. The Carlyle Group's acquisition of Booz Allen was one of the most notable but hardly the only example. I'm simply using this as a case study of what's been going on across the world with these private intelligence companies, many of whom use equity firms as a front because that gives them global reach. It gives them an excuse to be all over the planet, but it also helps to pay the bills for their fascism expansion operations. Now, why is this important? It's because I want for black people, black men in particular, to understand how the white supremacists who always run things operate. Power is not government. It's not private sector either. Power is power. Now, you thought that the Bushes went away because they were no longer in public office. That meant they were no longer in control. Well, Robert Mercer and his pals have their own armies called private security companies. That's why they have their own intelligence services too, which they call information technology providers. It seems these days, most every spy winds up working for one of these private corporations. What goes unsaid, however, is that even those that formerly worked for the government tend to show the same professional courtesy to these corporate spies as they do to the ones in government. Because when half the intelligence analysis workload is being handled by private companies, and when the guys who run these companies are responsible for putting the politicians in office, it becomes obvious that when it comes to intelligence operations, these corporations are auxiliaries of the government, though these days it seems the government is merely an auxiliary of these companies. These men are making it clear who the government really is, and as any employee knows, you can't spend your career in just one company, so it's best to be on good terms with the folks at the other places that you inevitably are going to want to go to. More than half of the people who work at the National Counterterrorism Center are contractors, employees for private corporations. Most of these contractors started off working for the government before they eventually jumped ship to go to some private corporation. This is what the world of intelligence has become, or rather, what it's reverted back to. There's an interesting book that you might want to look into sometime called Her Majesty's Spy Master. The book focuses on the reign of Queen Elizabeth I of England, but specifically it's about Sir Francis Walsingham, who was, to all intents and purposes, Queen Elizabeth I's intelligence chief. The book has a number of legerdemain and stories about England in the post-Dark Ages period. I dare not call it the Renaissance because nothing was reborn. However, in the book, there's one episode that they talk about where a number of British merchants, well-to-do, wealthy merchants, decided that maybe they didn't like the way that Elizabeth I was running the country, and maybe they would be a better government than her. See, Guy Fawkes wasn't the only Englishman who had his own plan to take over the British government by force. But these well-to-do merchants, they owned all kinds of seafront property. And their plan was to allow a foreign army that Britain was at war with to dock their ships on their seafront property so that they could offload their infantry there. I'm not making that up. Read the book, it's in there. And that's just one of many plots that Francis Walsingham uncovered. But it just goes to show the idea of these wealthy private individuals deciding that if they don't like the way things are going, they're going to use their money to change it. It's very old. If you want another example of private interests deciding that they are going to run the government by force, a more famous and recent incident involved General Smedley Butler. For those of you who don't know, Smedley Butler was a Marine Corps general, and he had achieved the highest rank the general could get. He's still, to this day, I think, the highest, most decorated officer that the U.S. has ever produced. He eventually became an anti-war activist, and he wrote a book called War is a Racket. It was published in 1935, and it discussed how it became obvious to General Butler that being sent all over the world was for no other reason than to expand corporate interests. He was being sent under the guise of putting down rebellions and such, but in reality he was just paving the way for corporations to get what they wanted. And he talked about it in his book and who was benefiting from it. As he said, Al Capone only worked in 3 states. I worked on 3 continents. He compared himself to a gangster, because that's what he had been reduced to. But the real reason that Smedley Butler felt the need to unburden himself of all the sins he had committed while in uniform was that shortly after Franklin Roosevelt took office, you had a bunch of corporations like Colgate, Firestone, and others who decided they wanted to overthrow the government. See, the kind of violent overthrows of government that happened in Japan, where the so-called super patriots have been killing people, or what happened with Germany with the National Socialists, that kind of thing where private individuals decide we're going to restore the greatness of the country, when what they're really trying to do is seize power for themselves, that's also been tried in the United States too. And they went to Smedley Butler because, as the former head of the Marines, and as the man who was the most decorated Marine officer ever, he commanded enormous respect from the military. And they wanted him to lead a group of soldiers to overthrow the government, a coup d'etat in the United States. Now, you might wonder, what did Franklin Roosevelt do about it? Roosevelt couldn't do anything. These corporations committed treason, bald-faced treason, and the President of the United States was helpless to do anything about them because he needed them more than they needed him. That was the reality. This is what private power has always been under white supremacy. These men didn't just get up one day and decide that power is best in our hands just yesterday. They've been doing this for hundreds of years, private individuals trying to figure out how to overthrow the government, become a government unto themselves. And it's not as if this is some sort of secret, by the way. You need to understand just how deep this runs. The idea of those who have money should be able to set up their own private intelligence services and be able to spy on the government and be able to affect and control your life. And to do it for the exclusive benefit and unilateral power of a select few handful of individuals. And it's not as if the government doesn't know this. Money runs at the very heart of intelligence services. As black men, we are never going to gain the upper hand on white supremacy as long as we're waiting for somebody else to do it for us or waiting for the white media to bring us information. We have to be actively gathering it ourselves. The best information is first-hand information, not fourth-hand information told to you by your enemy. As black people, we must make that a point. If you're in a position where you have financial wherewithal, you're supposed to be looking and going, well, I want to know what's going on in the world for my own interest and my own benefit, and I want to have it for myself. Not information being told to me by some third party who in all likelihood has interests that are completely and thoroughly counter to my own. You simply cannot separate finance from intelligence gathering. You just can't do it. And by the way, if you think that it's just me whistling Dixie here, or that I'm kind of laying it on a little thick and exaggerating, consider this. In May 2007, the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency decided they would hold a little confab. A little conference, but it was by invitation only, and their guest list was mostly comprised of people from the private sector, who the government was choosing who they were going to farm out work to. This conference involved a PowerPoint presentation given by a woman named Terry Everett. She was a senior procurement executive in the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and her presentation was entitled Procuring the Future. What she was doing was explaining to her colleagues what the makeup of the U.S. intelligence infrastructure was. This was in 2007 that this conference was held. One of her slides showed that a whopping 70% of the government's intelligence budget was being spent on contractors. Everett's slides also showed that in 1998, the government spent $18 billion on contracts. By 2006, it was $43.5 billion. So the U.S. government more than doubled the amount of money that it was giving to these private corporations to carry out intelligence gathering operations and analysis, all in an 8-year period. I want you to keep that in mind. This started in 1998, at least that's where she started tracking the numbers from. Now, who was president in 1998? Oh yeah, Bill Clinton. And didn't Hillary talk about a vast right-wing conspiracy? Well, they ought to know they were the ones helping to fund it. And to put this all in perspective for you, Edward Snowden, who I mentioned earlier, was himself an intelligence contractor. According to The Atlantic, Edward Snowden made over $200,000 a year working for Booz Allen Hamilton. Compare that to the average salary of an intelligence analyst in government, which is only about $78,000. And you probably heard about the NSA leaker with the rather eccentric name Reality Winner. She too worked for a private intelligence contracting company. On a side note, you got these white supremacists who are forever complaining that black children have weird names, though you never heard anyone saying that Reality Winner's name was strange. Just saying. But even after Edward Snowden, even after Reality Winner, nobody on the governmental left or the right has questioned the wisdom of outsourcing intelligence work. Nobody's looked at how much money has been spent, and nobody has asked what the hell are these private corporations doing with all of this exclusive, high-level governmental intelligence that they're being provided with. Instead of complaining about Edward Snowden, the government should have been asking what the men who run Booz Allen Hamilton have been doing with the information. Edward Snowden was only trying to provide the American people with an explanation of how much the government knows. It's what the government does with that information that ought to be a concern, because that information is not in the hands of a government that you have oversight over. It's in the hands of private individuals like Robert Mercer, and we already know what he believes. These companies now are the ones handling much of the government's dirty dealings. And when former CIA directors are the ones who own these companies, well, you're not going to be putting this genie back in the bottle. And in a nice bit of truth in advertising, during her presentation, Miss Terry Everett put up a slide that showed the operating philosophy of all intelligence organizations. We can't spy if we can't buy. Now, family, this is what a woman who worked for the director of the Office of National Intelligence put up on a screen at a conference where there were a bunch of private intelligence corporations in attendance. This is what they're telling each other. This is what they say behind the scenes when they think none of us can hear them. All of that stuff about duty, honor, that's just what they say for the rubes. The people dumb enough to believe that. In the real world, they understand. You're not going to be able to control anything without some sort of financing. You're not going to be able to cover up the dirty dealings that you do if you can't afford to pay for information. You're not going to be able to field spies and operatives all over the world. You're not going to be able to set up eyes and ears all over the planet unless you have a means of paying those eyes and ears and sustaining them. You're not going to be able to get people's lips to open unless you've got some money to pry those lips open. We can't spy if we can't buy. That's what the white supremacists themselves are saying. Intelligence gathering as a business transaction. It doesn't get much more blatant than that. Your tax dollars at work. I hope that now this is a little more clearly understood when I tell you that resources are the life's blood of intelligence organizations. You had one of the government's main henchmen put on a private presentation where she told this gang of insiders that without money, they can't do spy work. The bad guys understand the point of what having an economy is about. Now, this was at a government-financed event where they brought in a bunch of private contractors. And would you like to guess how many black people were in attendance for this closed-door private conference? I'll bet it's a nice round figure. 0. Now, this little presentation had been posted on the DIA's website, but they took it down when they realized people had seen it, and it was starting to make headlines. Hey, look what the DIA is saying. The DIA took it down, so they were fine with it being on the internet as long as nobody knew about it. As white supremacy sees it, the biggest problem with democracy is that it's potentially democratic. These guys don't want to serve government. They don't even want government to serve them. They want to be the government. The government they want is not a democracy or even a republic, but a fascist plutocracy, and we're almost there. Now, the reason I bring all this up is not to feed your need for conspiracy theories. First of all, black people as a group can't really handle getting in-depth about how white supremacy functions. I had planned for a while to go in-depth about Stratfor, but that's one that's going to have to wait. We're going to take this in stages. But the second reason that I don't do too much on this is because this isn't conspiracy theory, it's conspiracy fact. I'm not talking about something that I heard or have no evidence for. I'm only showing you what I can prove. I'm not trying to impress you with these tales of secrecy or any sort of palace intrigue. The entire reason why I tell you about Booz Allen Hamilton and why the Carlyle Group owned them and their global reach and white supremacy saying it takes money to spy, I tell you about all these private interests wanting to take over the government's functions and make sure that they have the exact same capabilities is because, family, we need an equalizer. This is something we need for ourselves. White supremacy has a particular weapon and we need one that can neutralize it. At the very least, we need protection from their weapons. White supremacists who want true power, they don't believe in sharing not only with their own government. This is how the world actually works. White supremacy has control over this planet, like it or not. And you're not going to change that by pretending they're not in control. And obviously the white supremacists are in charge because we damn sure aren't. Denying that reality won't make it go away. It might make you feel a little bit better for the moment about your position, but it won't change your position. See the world the way that it is. Admit to it the way that it is so that you can change the way that it is. I, for one, refuse to place any of my faith in the administrative arm of white supremacy. That's the government. Even if the government was all black, hell, even if it was all black first, nothing would change without resources. Nothing would get done without resources. That's the point that I'm trying to get across to you, family. Do not think that you're going to get black empowerment for free. Do not think that white supremacy is going to fall for free. Do not think you're going to get your freedom for free or get it on the cheap. It's going to cost you big. Now, you can wait until white supremacy finally decides it's time for it to cost you your life, or you can decide that you're going to open up your wallet and also open up your time for this. But you will pay for your freedom one way or the other. You are going to pay to fight white supremacy one way or the other. The only question is, how much is it going to cost? Now, we chose to outsource our economic security to white power, and tell me, how's that working out for us? Are we so silly, even at this late date, as to think that we're going to outsource our political security to white supremacy as well? We must have it all in our hands. I do not want to be trying to take information that I got from white supremacy's propaganda arm, and I gotta sit here and sift through it and discern it and turn over the tea leaves. There is an extent that they're talking to themselves, that's worthwhile, but when it comes to knowing what's going on in the world, around the country and the world, I should be getting that information from other black people. And I can tell you right now, Robert Mercer doesn't decide what he's going to do based on Fox News. The men who run the Carlyle Group, they don't make their decisions based on Sean Hannity's rantings or from CNBC. It's as simple as that. These men want the information for themselves. As was revealed in the documentary Fahrenheit 9/11, Poppy Bush takes advantage of a prerogative that very few presidents did. He received a presidential daily briefing. The same PDB, presidential daily briefing, that Donald Trump was getting. Former presidents have access to it too. Now, most presidents don't actually ask for it because what the hell are they going to do with it? But Poppy Bush did. And when you look at his position in the Carlyle Group, you gotta wonder, how many times did he use the intelligence that he received from his out-of-office PDB in order to do some insider trading? He was able to see what was coming down the pike before anyone else did. As a former president, that's the kind of value he could provide to a company. Hey, I can tell you what the CIA and the DIA is talking about. I can tell you what all these U.S. governmental agencies are making scuttlebutt about. This is information that only the president sees. And I got access to it, even though I'm not in office. You see how that kind of thing works now, don't you? Robert Mercer doesn't believe in getting his information even from Poppy Bush. Robert Mercer believes in having his own eyes and his own ears out there gathering information for him. That's what Robert Mercer believes in. That's important to keep in mind because this is what we're up against. We can beat the bad guys, but first we gotta quantify what the heck we're up against. That's how these guys are. Even trusting their own white government, they don't. They'll trust them to a point, but not to a fault. We need veto power over the administrative arm of white supremacy. We require veto power over them. We don't just need an equalizer, we need an edge. We need an advantage, a clear advantage, an unassailable advantage. And that kind of advantage is the best kind of advantage. Inside information. You gather it yourself. There's some things that are simply too important to be left to any legislative body or any gang of bureaucrats, no matter how dedicated or well-intentioned they may seem to be. Now, why is it we don't have this already? Why is it that this is not the topic of discussion for black people constantly? Well, frankly, too many black people want to play helpless. We are not looking for power. We're looking for an excuse to hide behind so that we don't have to stop playing around and actually do the hard work that power demands. The reality is this is because too many black people, black men in particular, happen to be intellectually lazy. That's why so many people you see in the comments sections trying to hide behind defeatist rhetoric as their excuse. It's like the old saying goes, if there's something you really want, then you'll find a way. And if you don't really want it, then what you'll find is an excuse. Well, we know where way too many black people fall in that little discussion. As we all know, 80% of the time, I can't is usually a euphemism for I won't. We have the material resources. We just don't have them aggregated. Our lack of political will and economic discipline is the reason white supremacists are running roughshod over us. It's because for too long we have lacked the political will or economic discipline to give rise to organizations of our own that are going to fight white supremacy. We have the funds. We see the need. But we're sitting back deciding, well, Professor Truth's going to do it, or, well, TBA is going to do it, Tariq's going to do it, or some of these people from the new voices of black media, they're the ones bringing it to our attention, so they're the ones who are going to do it. White supremacy is a group sport. Black empowerment must also be a group sport as well. Every black person has to be a single cell in an organism of black empowerment, not sitting back waiting to see what someone else is going to do. We all know what needs to be done. White supremacy has built entire constellations of institutions, not just one institution, not just one think tank. They've built entire systems of institutions meant to protect, preserve, and promote their power, and they use their economy to incentivize the rank and file white from the population to support those institutions. Why do you think you see so many people from the dominant society who idolize Ivy Leaguers? Why do you think you see advertisers chasing after and catering to that so-called educated demographic? Look at all the news programs, TV shows, and movies that present so many people from the dominant society as well established and as some sort of normal state. That this is just what normal is. The lesson they deliver is clear. This is what somebody from the dominant society is, or at least what they ought to aspire to be. This is why I tell my people to not become a fan of the white media. When they call their media programming, that's exactly what it is. They indoctrinate you. As you see it, the point of television shows you watch is to entertain you, give you something to do with your time, make you laugh, cry, or to give you some sort of meaningful entertainment experience. But as the men who actually own the white media see it, their job is to bypass your skepticism and reason. And they do this through the use of skillfully crafted narratives, both fictional and so-called news. The stuff that they put together as TV shows and news shows, what they see them as are media products. And what is the product that these media shows are putting together? It's to get you to drop your guard. That's what they produce. They produce people who are unaware. You start off looking at what they're saying, they call it BS, but then before you know it, you're lined up to see the latest movie from Disney or the latest TV show from whomever, and you don't know why that is. Black people are hideously oversampled when it comes to white media entertainment and programming, and when you look at that fact, you understand that for a lot of black people, this white media indoctrination has been very, very successful. Black folks will be the first ones to be lined up around the block for the new iPhone, but they're not lining up to try to figure out how to put white supremacy on its knees. We all saw videos of black women who were lined up to buy hair weaves, and in many cases you got these Asian salon owners who were attacking these black women, including a black grandmother who got punched in the face. You had black men who had worked to organize a protest and boycott of that particular establishment, but the problem was you had a whole bunch of black females who decided that it was more important that they get half off hair weave than it was that they make a statement for their empowerment. You have to make sure that if people are working against your interests, they pay a price for it. White supremacy is promoted and protected by the institutions that it's created. That's how it operates. That's why it's still standing. The so-called white media is meant to indoctrinate you to deify their institutions, to worship the very organizations and apparatuses that white supremacy has established for the sole purpose of empowering themselves and disempowering you. That's why institutions are created. Their entire purpose is to be cultural anchors. They are the guardians of ideas and ideals. But the question is, who's protecting your ideas? Who's protecting your ideals? Why does the white media spend so much time glorifying the institutions of white supremacy? Why the endless repetition of how great these white organizations and policies are? Why the endless parade of men in uniforms who are portraying people who work for this or that government agency, or they go to this or that university as being higher and better than everyone else? The reason that they do all of this endless repetition of the deification of white supremacist institutions and organizations is because they know that in order to get people to be loyal to something, first you have to get them to believe in it. That's why they show the images. They make sure that every time they show a soldier, there's never a hair out of place, not a single strand frayed, not a single speck on the uniform. They always have the camera positioned at a low vantage point so that the person that they're putting in front of the camera looks tall and powerful. Make sure that you present these people as pristine examples of austere manhood, or at least an acceptable version of it. They do that because it's meant to program you to believe in these institutions. That's what the images are for. Now you got the capitalist over here who lambasted the Russians because the Russians demanded that everything be given for the state. But what goes unsaid is that the capitalists demand the exact same thing, that people give everything from the state run by them. You get an education so that you can better serve some corporation more effectively. And if you get a degree and go into government, well, as you've seen with the intelligence sphere, the only reason to go into government is so that you can one day get the kind of specialized insider knowledge and training that will enable you to be more effective when you inevitably leave to go work for some corporation, doing the exact same job, but for a lot more pay. The so-called public sector was all but gutted a long time ago by private power, though they left just enough of the so-called public sector in place that they've actually fooled the public into thinking that they still have a government. And while the white media keeps people distracted with congressional sex scandals, or better yet, with the this or that bad black person, the Bill Cosbys, the R. Kellys, or whomever, or the back and forth between the two political puppet parties, no one seems to have noticed that the government has quietly handed over much of its functions and, in many cases, its authority to private corporations, giving them the exact same authority and powers that previously had been the exclusive domain of the government. These new powers and functions are not in the hands of some disinterested old men. They're in the hands of hardcore white supremacists like Eric Prince, founder of Blackwater, Robert Mercer, the billionaire tech investor, in the hands of the Bush crime family, who masterminded both the Willie Horton ad and the destruction of New Orleans, which cost over 1,000 lives, mostly black. Sure, Poppy Bush was former director of the CIA, and his Secretary of State, James Baker, was over the CIA. But these men were able to create their own personal intelligence agency. And what do you think that these men do with the intelligence that they gather? You think they're just sitting back and going, well, this is going to help our stock investments? No. They're doing far more than that. They do things in the real world with this information. You got to wonder how many people have died as a result of these private organizations. You see, the CIA has 4 directorates. The Directorate of Administration, which runs the CIA. The Directorate of Science and Technology, that creates the CIA's weapons and equipment. The Directorate of Intelligence, for all of you Jack Ryan fans out there, that's who Jack Ryan works for, the Directorate of Intelligence as an analyst, and they analyze the information gathered. And finally, you have the Directorate of Operations. Now, these are the men who actually are responsible for going out and doing the real spy work. People like Valerie Plame, she was in the Directorate of Operations. Her job was to bribe, cajole, coerce, blackmail, whatever it takes to get the information they need. But the Directorate of Operations does a lot more than that. When called upon, they perform break-ins, bombings, and occasionally assassinations. See, that's what the U.S. government has. Do you think that these private corporations who are hiring all of these ex-spies and all these ex-intelligence people and doing much of the government's intelligence workload and got a hand and a foot in every corner of the globe, you think that they're not also responsible for taking lives as well? You think they don't do that on a regular basis too? When Eric Prince hires all of these former special forces and former military personnel, you think he's the only one who hires individuals who are trained to kill? You think he's the only one who does it? You think these private corporations, the private intelligence corporations, don't do it? In the military, people have rank, E1, G1, O3, etc. And in government service, there's also civil rank as well, GS1 through GS15. Now, this kind of format is done in order to give structure to the governmental organizations. But what it also does is makes it easier for people to transition out of governmental service, be it the military or the civil sector, into the private sector. They know pretty much where they're going to land. This is the aggregate result of the huge overlap between these private corporations and the government that they have constant contact with. They've structured themselves so as to accommodate each other. And since government is the shadow cast by business, you see a similar mirroring of structure in the private sector. And that's done so that whenever this or that bureaucrat has to deal with the private sector, they know who their corporate counterpart is. When people in the government get ready to go into the private sector, they know who their private sector counterparts are, and they also know where on the corporate ladder they expect to land. Sure, they don't use the same names as the government, but they perform the exact same functions. The ties between the government corporations are beyond incestuous. It's absolutely no coincidence that these corporations keep structuring themselves like the government, especially these days. They got a legislative branch, a military branch, an intelligence branch, and even a propaganda arm. None of this is accidental. This doesn't happen because all of those former presidents and Congress people and cabinet members prefer the structure of government. The reason it happens is because they see themselves as having set up their own government, privately owned, for their interest alone. Now, family, we have to come to recognize these realities. The bad guys have an enormous head start. We can catch up to them. Hell, we can overtake them. But this is going to require a massive and hyper-aggressive change in our priorities and in the way that we focus ourselves. And that begins with changing the discourse among black people, black men in particular. We don't need the majority of black folks to go along with it, the majority of which are not going to be helping. Most people are sheep. Black people have proven themselves to be a lot of black sheep. But what we require is merely a critical mass of the right black people. This is not going to come down to a numbers game. It's not overwhelming the enemy with numbers. It's going to be getting critical masses of black people, enough to get the job done. We don't need a ton of black people to get the job done. What we need, as TBA put it, is a sufficient number who have brought enough resources to inflict their will. And that's important, the mentality of we are inflicting our will, we're imposing our will, we ain't asking, we're doing this. Over your objections and over your opposition, we're still doing it. We're not here to make nice. We're here to make progress. Now, we've done this a number of times, small scale and for limited objectives, and this is fine in the beginning stages because we're just getting started. But our aims, our ambitions, our thirst for power simply must become far more voracious and far more ambitious. They must become all-consuming. The world we live in is one where the people who run things want power all in their own hands. The question is, do you? Show me where you put your resources, and I'll tell you whether you have any power at all. It's not wrong for you to want an intelligence agency of your own. You need one. It's not wrong for you to decide that you want to know what these other people are doing, especially when they've been spending 500 years attacking you. You're a fool if you don't get realistic about that. You are a fool if you don't make it a point to be focused on what your enemy is doing, especially when the main thing your enemy does is to attack you. You're a fool if you don't care about that. Or you try to find an excuse for why you shouldn't be concerned. That's suicidal. That's just common sense. I told you about the book Gideon's Spies. The book started off with Palestine in the beginning of the 20th century. The Jewish residents who lived in that area had frequent skirmishes with the Palestinians who owned the land. And that being the case, they decided, hey, we need to know what's going on before we have the next rocks and bricks and bottles thrown at us. We need to know what's happening before it occurs. And that book is important because Gideon's Spies deals with the origins of the Mossad. Before there was a Mossad, before there was a state of Israel, there were all of these Jewish people who said, we need to actually have intelligence gathering for ourselves. I think it was Stephen Kotkin who said it best, after a revolution, it's not the ideas that carry over, it's the institutions. You want to know why the Mossad was able to get up and running so quickly? Yeah, a large part of it happened to be U.S. funding and U.S. backing, but other countries have not been able to duplicate what it was the Israelis did. And the main reason why was the Israelis had already been running intelligence operations long before there was a nation of Israel. You don't see any black organizations that are dedicated solely to intelligence gathering, and we need a number of them, not just one. That's what this little chat is about. We need to get the ball rolling on that. We need institutions that are dedicated to preserving and promoting our power and being proactive about it. You don't wait until the enemy's at the gates. I think the president who understood the most about how intelligence gathering was supposed to be used was President Eisenhower. Eisenhower understood how intelligence was supposed to be used, and you know that he did because nothing happened. Not because people weren't trying to do things. There were lots of people trying to do things. But when you're on top of your game, nothing occurs. Your enemies are shut down before anyone even knows that they're afoot. And that's what Sun Tzu wrote in his book, The Art of War. He wrote that the best possible defense is not when you have means of repelling the enemy's attack. The best possible type of defense is when you stop the enemy before they can attack, before they can strike. That is best. When you're able to look at the people on the opposing team and you can say, hey, look at that guy over there. Look at some of the things he's done, some of the things he's said. You know, if this guy gets himself into a position of authority, he could be a real problem for us. You want to be in a position where you're able to do things against your enemies before they even realize you've been undermining them, which is what white supremacy has been doing against us. Leaders who have been killed, like Malcolm, Martin, Fred Hampton, leadership killed before they've had a chance to come into their own. But you also have other operations. using money in order to buy off fakers, frauds, and phonies, to undermine and derange the internal politics of your enemies. Black Lives Matters. Yeah, you can have D. Ray McKeeson saying that the black community is homophobic. So we need to focus on homophobia, not on the cops who are killing these black people. This is where intelligence operations have their sharpest and best expression. It's not about planting bombs. It's about blowing your enemy off course before they can do anything against you. And you know what? We need some of that. We don't merely need the desire for intelligence gathering or the ability to do intelligence gathering. We also have to have that hunger that says, I want to know what's going on. And we got to make sure we use the information gathered to empower and protect ourselves. Let's start identifying who these burgeoning thought leaders of white supremacy are. The ones behind the scenes to the point that you don't see them. People like Robert Mercer and such. The guys who've been funding the Richard Spencers and others. What can we do to undermine them? What can we do to harry and harass them? What can we do to blunt their effectiveness and ultimately to undermine their ability to operate? What can we do against them? Who do we got to talk to? Whose palms do we have to grease? And that's something black folks need to get used to. If you ever watched the movie American Gangster, you saw a portrayal of how Frank Lucas became an enormous drug dealer. But the part that wasn't stated as loudly as it should have been was Frank Lucas believed in paying people off. You look at documentaries like Cocaine Cowboys and you see that that's something that the more intelligent drug dealers in the U.S. were doing. They were paying people off. They understood that at the end of the day, you can undermine those bonds and relationships against your opponent, but you're going to have to actually put resources behind that too. Money can actually split any group of people. White supremacy knows this, which is why they spend so much time trying to make sure that black folks remain poor, because if black people have some resources, they're going to start leveraging those resources for their own benefit. Because as long as black people think that they're going to get power for free, nothing is going to change. It simply won't. As long as black people are more focused on the next football game or the next basketball game and not interested in the game of power politics, nothing's going to change except for one thing. The numbers of black people are going to decrease drastically because, you see, white supremacy is not playing any games. You may think that you have the time for something else, but white supremacy, as far as they're concerned, they've got time for nothing else except you. I predict that we're going to see a thinning of the herd. A lot of black people are going to become casualties of the race war that white supremacy is fighting against us. And these black folks suffer from the same problem that a lot of these black celebrities do. Apparently, they think they've got something better to do than ensure their survival. And by the time they realize that white supremacy is now getting around to them, it's just too damn late. I'm not making excuses for things that haven't been done. I'm not going to focus on things that don't matter. The problem isn't that we don't have the skill or the resources. The problem is we still persist in thinking that somebody else is going to do it for us. Well, let me tell you something. When it comes to fighting white supremacy, nobody else is going to gather the information for you. The Democrats are certainly not going to do it. White liberals are not going to do it. For 150 years, we've been begging them to tattle on these white supremacists, and they haven't done it. We've been begging and begging. What they've been doing is they made it very clear. They'll give a couple of insincere words about how black people are treated, but when it comes time to actually work against white supremacy, they're not doing it. And the reason why is the exact same white privilege that a Richard Spencer or a Dylan Roof or a Kyle Rittenhouse depends on is the exact same white privilege that Nancy Pelosi and others depend upon. The same white privilege that tethers the Bush crime family to their goodies, guarantees, and giveaways is the same white privilege that tethers George Soros to his. So the moral of the story is we're not going to sit around waiting to see if some good-hearted person from the dominant society will finally come along and give us a few crumbs. And we're also not going to sit around waiting to see if some good-hearted person from that same sector is going to be doing intelligence gathering for us. We're going to be proactive about this. We must be proactive about it. You would not wait and hope that someone's going to spoon feed you food any more than you should be waiting to see if someone's going to spoon feed you intelligence. You're going to have to learn how to get it for yourself. And the good news is we've already been doing it. We just haven't been organized about it and haven't been persistent. Time for that to change. This takes time. It takes effort. We can pick up the skills necessary. Hell, we've already got most of them to begin with. Just a matter of putting resources and focus behind it. That's the stage that we're at now. And this is the barrier that we have to push through. We don't have a resource problem. We have a prioritization problem. And if you haven't prioritized your survival, then you won't survive. Good evening and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Jacques Hargett, Tyrone Leake, Wayne Curtis, Kenneth Johnson, and R. Laz. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.